it looks like in a map of Indigenous youth perspectives, but also now that we kind of understand where we are at, now we want to look at the future and where we want to go. And so with that piece, I want to kind of think back to the presentations that were provided so far, the panels, some of the ideas and expressions in the community conversations here. And with that, I want to ask this question and kind of recenters here at Miniki Wakan to really get at that future. So after listening to presentations so far, what type of new and untried projects, models, or opportunities could emerge and start at Miniki Wakan Water Summit? Again, after listening to presentations so far, what type of new and untried projects, models, or opportunities could emerge and start at the Miniki Wakan Water Summit? What would excite Indigenous youth to be collectively involved in communicating and engaging the world Indigenous community in the areas of water?
The way that I take this question is, what opportunities can emerge from Miniki Wakan? And the idea that if everyone was to just look to someone at your table right now, ask them where they're from. Everyone's from a different place here. I'm from Saskatchewan. I met someone yesterday from Minneapolis over lunch. In the morning I met someone from, I don't even know what state it was, the summit, so we really have an opportunity here to look at one another and connect. Connect through social media, connect through mail, postage, phone numbers, organizations, and keep those connections going, because those connections, those things that you see, and the relationships that you're going to build here is going to be what's going to help fuel you for the future. There might be another water summit where we come down and we see each other once again. I might meet you somewhere across the country, or maybe in another country, things like that. So what really fuels movements, what really fuels the power to change is the relationships that we have in this room. Yesterday I kept thinking there was an elder that had spoke yesterday. He had the mic and he was talking about the government, the United States government. And there was so much fuel and power and wisdom and emotion in his. I'll never forget exactly what he heard. And it's still in my head. And years down the line, I'll think of that same thing again. He talked about the government here, and in lack of better words, killing other leaders that tried to create that change. That was so powerful, and there is a reason why we had the opportunity to have that elder say that to us here, just like today. So I really, my answer is, what are the opportunities that can come from this summit is the connections that we're building, because when the fuel starts burning and then we start going at it, when change starts happening, it's what is going to change and create change is these relationships, being able to see one another, because at the end of the day, no matter where we come from, we're all human beings. We're all beings, animals, plants, elements, us. We're no different from one another. And water, out of everything in the world, oxygen too, but water really is what connects us all. So in terms of opportunities that can emerge from here is the relationships and the connections that we can build to take back home to our home fires and to continue on our journey.
So the part of your question that really stuck out to me was how to excite youth in the Water Summit. And something that really jumped out to me was in those digital stories, which I had done in college as well. And I think it's really empowering for a person to tell their own story. And I would say that self-expression through art or other media forms could really build up this story that we're creating here. And then that way everyone has an opportunity to tell their own, and then we can all learn from it as well. And I think those videos, or if it's a song, a poem, a play, or just a piece of art, I think those things tell stories that are really deep and personal and can influence some change.
I guess for myself, it would be what Heather was saying, like the building relations and connections. And I think in 2021, we are bringing the Water Summit to our community in Canada. And then as the years go on and we keep building relationships, you never know if you might want to host the Water Summit in your community. And another thing would be to maybe bring youth down and maybe hold like a summer camp around water. Because that's one of my dreams when I finish in like 4 years, is to start my own youth camp, like a culturally traditional youth camp around water and everything else. And so far, I'm kind of starting that now with the talking circles that I do at the Exshaw School, and now becoming a faculty for the Banff Center and doing a session around water. And the program is called Good Governance for Councils and Boards. And the participants are people that are way up there. And it makes me a little nervous, but it's just talking about what I know. And it's just keeping that fire going and just talking about what you believe in, I guess. Yeah.
So, for a water summit, what comes to mind to me is all of my past experiences. So, and what I know that what works with listening and communicating, and what really is effective is having traditional leaders really interested in active within what the community wants, I guess, or just leading or being at the discussion tables with the youth and the community members to make them feel valid. And being on the land is another key concept instead of being in the room, the environment. And being active. So what comes to mind is the one time we had the GWF, the Global Water Futures gathering that they have every 4 years or once a year. And it's a huge gathering with all of these professors and researchers, and that creates dialogue with the water and getting to know First Nations needs and way of life. So what we did, Six Nations was the host, our project really, and what we did was got them to do activities and create dialogue at the same time. And so they really got to have the experience instead of just talking about it or reading about it. And that's the only way you really truly understand these different things in our way of life. So some things that they really loved was we had them on the river with canoes and kayaks. We had archery, and we have lacrosse. And I don't know if anybody knows what lacrosse is, but it's our staple game at Six Nations, and we have some of the best players in the world, I'd say. Even though we have small populations because it's our game. Anyways, we did those things and they really loved it. Now they want us to have it every year because it was so effective. And those are the things that's how our community also responds, is when the youth are included at the table and the traditional leaders at the same time, and just watching those discussions, you can learn a lot from the youth and the elders. Because even in our traditional, or Mohawk territory, there's different stages of life, and from like adulthood to like menopause, you are a worker and a parent, and you work. So listening to the voices of the youth and the elderly and the leaders is really important to listen to. And so land-based,
having the youth and the leaders and being active and learning, active learning. Yeah.
Thank you. So oftentimes in Indigenous communities, we are pushing for the revitalization of Indigenous knowledge, sometimes called traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, and other names for it, but each with our own understanding. So we don't want to come with any assumptions here, but for the Wakan, World Indigenous Peoples Decade of Water, we lead with Wakan as a theme and guiding mandate for this work and for our relatives and partners and coordinators to help us carry this out. So what we want to do is just not provide any assumptions here or come with that. We want to get your perspective as Indigenous youth and just who you are on this question of Indigenous knowledge on water in the world today. And so with that, I ask this: why is Indigenous knowledge important to water and the world today? Why is Indigenous knowledge important to water and the world today? I'm just gonna stay like a
I
statue.
think there's a routine in this. I'm always picked first. Okay. Okay. So why is Indigenous knowledge important to water and to the world today? When I think about Indigenous knowledge, or the term Indigenous knowledge, I think about the inherent stories that are passed down through generation, through blood DNA, through blood knowledge, and through the stories you hear and your lived experiences. When I think about why it's important to the topic of water and why it's a global issue or a global aspect, is that oftentimes, like someone had mentioned earlier about stories, and I really, something that's come across my work recently in the last year, I do a lot of advocacy work in Canada on educational rights. That's my passion and political, on a political spectrum within Saskatchewan, in terms of post-secondary education as a treaty right. And the topic of water sort of all kind of just come back about, I was actually in Colombia fairly recently in February, and I was talking with an individual there that I just met that day, and we were talking about water, and that sort of sprung, and we were talking about what the water's like there, and the water was there's certain rivers in that region that you can drink of. Well, I'm from the Plains region in Colombia, or in Canada, so there's not really any waterfalls where I'm from. There's maybe creeks and things like that. So my experience with water, it was always the clean water came from the blue jugs, and the water that you bathed with, or you put in a pasture, or the horse troughs come from the hose and from the tap. And then all our water of the reserve came from wells. My reserve, my First Nations community back home, still goes under cisterns and wells. They don't have the system isn't as adapted as some other communities that may have access to those different water treatment plants. And so in terms of access to clean drinking water and access to adequate just water in general, it's still very much limited. So when I think about Indigenous knowledge, I think about those lived experiences, but I also think about the stories that my kukum used to tell me growing up, or my nukum, and that means grandmother in Cree, or my grandma's side, my dad's side too as well. And one story that came to mind was about where I'm from in southern Saskatchewan. We're based off of the Qu'Appelle River, and the Qu'Appelle River Valley was where Treaty 4 was signed, and it's right near the Métis settlement where my grandmother grew up. And she told me a story, and I've heard this story a few times, and actually, sorry, I have to retrace that. She didn't tell it to me, but my mother told it to me. My kukum died when I was 6. So my mom told me this story that when she was a little girl, there used to be turtles in Saskatchewan, that she remembers going to swim in a lake somewhere, and there was turtles. And I had asked my mom, what do you mean turtles? Like, I don't never seen turtles in Saskatchewan. I see them at the pet store, maybe. It might be different in Ontario, it might be different in other regions in eastern and western parts, but in the prairie provinces, it's you don't really hear of that. And so I used to always kind of think that was a tall tale. And it wasn't until I got older and older that I'd ask my mom that story. I'd go back and say, Mom, do you remember telling me about turtles that you used to swim in? And my mom would go, yeah, that's true. Like, I'm not lying to you. And I think about those stories and think about, wow, I wonder what that would have meant. And, you know, in the regions of Saskatchewan, scientists over the years have started to look at uncover different animal species that were in and around the area. You know, my dad's community comes from Cypress Hills, Saskatchewan. It's the tallest point in Saskatchewan. And the biology of the animals there, and what the old people used to talk about, with the stories that I heard growing up, was that there was different type of animals that would be in that region of Cypress Hills. And when the communities would go, they would go there and they would have their ceremonies, and they still do today, the Nakota people of Saskatchewan region. They would meet with the Stoney Nakotas, and they would meet with other regions. The Assiniboines would go to the Cypress Hills. And it was years and years later that scientists are now uncovering that those same species, those old ones talked about, and that they brought in through those oral storytellings, those stories we heard growing up, that's coming true. Well, it is true. It's always been true. But it's that affirmation that these scientists are now saying, well, yeah, actually, they were there when all along, you know, those stories were true. They were telling you, they were saying that those animals, those certain animals that they talked about were there, you know. Another one was when it comes to water, there used to be a lake in the middle of my community on my mom's side, and my mom would talk about that lake having healing powers, and how the old ones would go and have ceremonies in there. And when they had, back in the 70s, when they had a ceremony, and the RCMP came and they arrested my grandfather, and they arrested a bunch of others for holding the ceremonies, the rain dance, for the Nakotas, you call them sun dances, but the Crees, I've heard of the term rain dance. And you know, that's a ceremony itself that uses water. It's that sacrifice of water and food for 4 days to dance and to you know, call for those prayers. And that lake, that small dugout where my mom talks about, it's all dried up now. And for me, when I think about the stories that my mom talks about, that in the middle of this, it's called the Big Bush Ave Reserve, but in the middle of this bush, there's that lake where they used to go and do those ceremonies. There's no more water there anymore. So when I think about Indigenous knowledge to the world of today, I think about those stories, and I think about what did those stories mean. And it's unfortunate that I'll never get to experience that water in that lake and experience those ceremonies that went on there. Doesn't mean that those ceremonies aren't going to happen again. They'll probably just move them somewhere else. But those sacred sites and those spots that are intergenerational, it's because of the effect of global change, because of the effect of what's going on in the world. And when it comes to Indigenous knowledge and water, I think the other thing that's important to acknowledge is the Indigenous knowledge that is global is pretty much, in my eyes and in my experience, is quite similar. We all have the same sort of teachings. We all have the same things we talk about. We talk about 4 directions and number 4 being a sacred number. Down in Colombia, when I spent time down there, number 4 was a sacred number for them too. You know, when I think about in Siberia, I have a friend that's from Siberia, and I've always wanted to go visit. But she has a lot of, we used to always share different things and knowledge. She'd go, oh yeah, we have that same sort of thing too. Like, you know, we think about, we pray to different elements. And I would think, wow, that's so interesting, you know. When you talk about, you know, there's conversations about India, and there's conversations about other Indigenous regions, and we need to acknowledge that those people who are Indigenous to those lands, those are the knowledge keepers, and those are the ones that are going to really be the land stewards for the future. And when it comes to water issues, those are the voices that need to be in the forefront. another thing that I always hear is for youth. Everyone always advocates for youth. And I've been in spaces where I've sat at tables kind of like this, where I've been asked my opinion. And I never hear any callbacks, never hear any report backs of why was my voice needed? Was it needed for a photo op? Was it needed for this organization to look good? What were you gonna do with my knowledge? Because my knowledge comes from knowledge that I heard from my grandmothers, from my mother, you know? And so when it comes to Indigenous knowledge, the importance to water in the world today, I think that we need to proactively and critically think about how we take that knowledge and not just, and I don't call out non-Indigenous people, I call it Indigenous people too because we do it a lot, where we advocate for certain things, but we don't think about it. When you go to conferences, and I'm really glad this is not here, but you go to water conferences and they have bottled water. I'm always like, what? Like our conferences about pipelines, when they bring the speakers to the pipeline on a plane, and I'm like, couldn't you webcam that? You know, like things like that, like it's a catch-22 kind of thing, right? So being proactive about how we look at it, and then also like really being responsible to Indigenous knowledge, because we're not just, youth voices, also, that's the big issue, is youth always get exploited because we're always told to talk and talk and talk, but we're never like really given that true acknowledgement or told we're responsible. Same as for Indigenous knowledge in academia. Indigenous knowledge is just as great and is as someone with a degree, a paper. Like, I'm no different than someone who doesn't have a degree. I'm no different than someone who, you know, there's no borderline, and we need to really retrace that. I think a lot of advocacy that you see on different organization levels, they talk about the importance of Indigenous people, they talk about the importance of Indigenous knowledge, and they talk about the importance of global issues that have Indigenous people in it. Sorry, I have to burp. But they don't, but they don't, it's just kind of there. There's nothing else done. And yeah, so I it's kind of a lot, but like, I think that Indigenous knowledge is important to water and to the world today, but I think we need to be very critical and very, very careful how we input that and we output that. Because at the end of our day, our knowledge is ours. Our research is ours. Our data is ours. Our stories are ours. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, I guess from a personal story on why Indigenous knowledge is important today is that from when I was a little girl and hearing the history between the government and Indigenous people, I hated being Indigenous. I never spoke my language. I never practiced my culture. And I always used to embarrass my grandma in the store when I would talk English. And then, but like I still paid attention. And like from my reason why I didn't like being Indigenous was because of hearing the history. I thought non-Indigenous people had an easier life. And so I pretty much my whole childhood I tried to be non-Indigenous. I even dyed my hair blonde once, but it looked like the rug, and so my dad took me to the salon the next day. But that was the last time. And but like seeing my grandma and seeing her practice like the culture, I paid attention, but I never practiced it until I got older, and then people started asking me questions about my culture, and then I just kind of had like a holy shit moment, because I didn't know. But it's been about 11 going on 12 years. I think it'll be 12 years tomorrow since my grandma passed away. But after she passed, I started getting dreams of what she used to do. And so I taught myself how to do the stuff my grandma did. There's still a few things that I need to learn, and now I ask my mom questions every chance I get. Because I don't, like I speak my language, but I don't know like the old words. And so every day I'm still learning. And when I went to New York, the first time I met Wakan and Thorn, the two men in black suits, like I was really self-conscious on what I was gonna wear. I really had like my blazer, my dress clothes and everything, and I was really self-conscious. But I brought my moccasins and my dress. And that year I met, was it Brenda Whitebull? Sitting Bull's great-great-granddaughter? Well, I met her, and then I told her that how I was feeling, and she told me, don't be embarrassed to wear your culture and walk in your culture every day. And so now I wear my moccasins every chance I get, but not this week because I'm resoling them. And Thorne asked me if that's why I was wearing sandals yesterday. And so it's just little things like that. It makes me proud to be who I am now, but I'm still learning as I go. And I'm going to be 30 pretty soon. But yeah, I'm still learning, and you're never too old to learn. And it's really important. And one thing that really reminded me of that was I have a daughter. Her name is Nakota. And so I try to, I guess, instill my knowledge in her. But it just kind of showed me that kids do pay attention to what you do, because when we went to my home community in Kootenai Plains, we went by the water and she was quiet. And so I kind of freaked out. I looked behind me and she had her hands like praying hands and looking towards the water. And she said, "There, it's all better." So that really reminded me of just to keep going. Yeah.
So I think to answer that question, you have to think about what is Indigenous knowledge. And that's a big question. And from what I think is Indigenous knowledge is lived experiences. And what I think Indigenous knowledge is the knowledge that my dad has. For an example, if you don't know my dad's Chief Overlooking Horse. So he's been taught since he was 12 years old the ways of how to be a leader. And so that right there, all of that, his whole life is Indigenous knowledge. Everything that he knows is Indigenous knowledge. And I was talking to the grandmother earlier again, and it reminded me of all of America, North America, Canada was all native land, and we today are the surviving nations that went through colonialism, all the 4 phases of colonialism, and I think we have to even recognize those nations that didn't make it. There's a lot of nations that didn't make it. I don't know if you know some of them. There's some. I know that there's near 6 nations anyways. We have, and all those relationships that were lost, like, what were they called? Tuvalu? They were Sioux that lived with 6 nations, people that we adopted into. And so there's a lot of Tuvalu that don't exist anymore, or they may be like one family, and maybe one family has like a little bit of Tuvalu in them, but carrying on that language and those ceremonies are no more. So we have to remember that our history, and that was all inhabited by traditional knowledge. And what we have right now, well, like our chief back home at 6 Nations, he said that we only have a little bit of knowledge compared to what our ancestors had. We had star knowledge, we had everything. We had everything, and it, like my mom said before, it just got interrupted, but it's still here. But that's what traditional knowledge is the knowledge that we had and that we are trying to revive, and that we still have. But that's what traditional knowledge is, and there's colonial knowledge that tries to say like how she felt lesser than, and that it wasn't, that she didn't feel like that she wanted to be colonialized because she thought it was a better and easier life. And when I mentioned the 4 stages of colonialism, there was the sicknesses with the blankets, the illnesses, because we didn't have any illnesses. I know that we had arthritis, and we had one other one, sickness. But those were the only sicknesses that we had. We didn't have a high rate in diabetes. We didn't have any of those things because we ate off the land and we lived with the land. And there are no sicknesses with that way of life. So I think it really is everything in traditional and indigenous knowledge, because we already have science, we already have, like I said, star knowledge, navigation.